The March on Washington was a march for jobs and freedom that took place in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963, less than a century after slavery was abolished in the United States. Its purpose was to dramatize the rights of Black Americans to political and economic equality. Although African Americans have been legally freed from slavery, become citizens, and given voting rights, many continue to face economic and political repression. Jim Crow laws, a system of legal discrimination, ensured that Black Americans remained second-class citizens. The March on Washington was designed specifically to advocate passage of the Civil Rights Act that had been stalled in Congress at the time. This march eventually became an important part of the rapidly expanding civil rights movement.
At the time of the march, there were high levels of Black unemployment, work that offered most African Americans only minimal wage and poor job mobility, systematic disenfranchisement of many African Americans, and persistence of racial segregation in the South. Going into the march, the leaders had several objectives that they hoped to achieve through peaceful, nonviolent protests. Their goals were to ensure the immediate elimination of school segregation, develop a program of public works that included job training for the unemployed, establish a federal law prohibiting discrimination in public or private hiring, and set up a $2 an hour minimum wage nationwide. Lastly, they wanted enforcement of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution by reducing congressional representation from states that disenfranchise citizens. A. Philip Randolph had devised the idea for a march on Washington to demand jobs and desegregation as early as 1941, but the first movement failed to gain full support.
The March on Washington was the largest mass demonstration ever seen in the nation's capital. It was one of the first to have extensive international television coverage, and the march drew a media assembly larger than the Kennedy inauguration 2 years earlier. Noted for its civility and peacefulness, not a single serious violent incident broke out through the entire day. At least 250,000 to 400,000 demonstrators participated in the march, and a quarter of the people who attended the march were white. President Kennedy initially opposed the march because he wanted his civil rights bill to pass, and any violence or disorder at the march would make passing the bill much more difficult. The march organizers agreed at the beginning of July that the marchers would gather at the foot of the Washington Monument and march less than a mile through the streets of Washington to a rally at the Lincoln Memorial from the halls of Congress. There were two lines of marchers. One, the main group, was led by the Big Six: Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young Jr., John Lewis, James Farmer, A. Philip Randolph, and Martin Luther King Jr. The second was led following a different route by the wives of the march leaders. King addressed the audience from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and delivered his infamous I Have a Dream speech, the most powerful and important address delivered by a civil rights leader in the 20th century. Martin Luther King Jr. was an eloquent and popular voice of the African American civil rights movement from the time of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956 to his murder in 1968.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The March on Washington created momentum for the Civil Rights Act. After King's I Have a Dream speech, the event's key organizers read their demands of lawmakers to the crowd. Some of the demands were met, others were not. However, the principal demand was comprehensive and effective civil rights legislation, and this came within a year. While the March on Washington did not change the minds of Southern Democrats or Allied Republicans, it helped to build popular support, especially among whites, for a civil rights revolution that transformed America's laws and politics. The march helped to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The March on Washington was a symbolic movement, if not a turning point. The laws it led to truly changed the culture. It inspired and focused people at the time when anger and frustration threatened both the sense of hope and the courageous nonviolence that had characterized the civil rights movement.
Martin Luther King's message of nonviolence and commitment to freedom and equality remains applicable to many issues to this day. Even though the March on Washington happened in 1963, today there have been many current issues, one being standardized testing. The majority of educators agree that the current testing format is not ideal and does not accurately portray what an individual has learned during their years of schooling. Standardized tests used in isolation are not the best evidence of performance. Some students are brilliant thinkers, but poor test takers. Given the opportunity to show what they know in a hands-on manner, many students who fail traditional tests could demonstrate that they indeed have mastered the concepts. There are several parties across the globe that have formed as a response to their opposition of standardized testing, the most well-known being United Opt-out International. Members of the United Opt-out International organization are dedicated to the elimination of high-stakes testing in public education.
Many people believe that standardized tests don't fully grasp a child's intellect and do not consider external factors such as anxiety. Colleges also look at high school grades, courses, extracurricular activities, recommendation letters, and application letters, yet standardized tests are still important in gaining college acceptance. Protesters argue that the tests fail to measure important attributes such as creativity and critical thinking skills. Studies show that standardized tests reward superficial thinking, may discourage analytical thinking, and develop cultural bias. A wide debate amongst educational leaders is whether standardized testing should account for the value of education.
The controversial standardized testing attributes have created a debate from multiple organizations that seek reform for students in which standardized testing is not beneficial. Similar to Martin Luther King's efforts during the March on Washington, these organizations seek equality specifically for students, and they also advocate for fair testing. Members of the movement to end corporate education reform are dedicated to the elimination of high-stakes testing in public education. President Barack Obama quoted that he wants to work with both parties in Congress to replace No Child Left Behind with a smarter law that addresses the overuse of standardized tests. There are also organizations such as fairtest.org, a civil rights organization that informs people about standardized testing and advocates for fair testing as well.
Overall, debates conclude that standardized achievement tests do supply the evidence needed to make norm-reference interpretations of students' knowledge and/or skill in relationship to those of students nationally. However, there are also organizations and arguments that consider the relationship between the test and external factors that can hinder students' performance and do not provide a clear representation of the student's overall intellectual and performance ability. The March on Washington and standardized tests raise the importance of equality through different aspects of discrimination in certain groups, whether it be students or African Americans. These issues of equality still continue today, even after the Monumental Freedom March on Washington in 1963.